There are structures that do more than inspire awe. They compel a deeper question. Were they ever meant to exist at all? More than 1,000 tons of concrete and steel stand upon the summit of a barren mountain, rising hundreds of meters above sea level. Here, the winds can exceed 200 kilometers per hour. There is no natural shelter, no ideal condition for construction. By all reason, it should not have endured for so long. And yet, it remains. With arms outstretched against the sky of Rio de Janeiro, it gazes over a city in constant motion, as though it does not belong to this age, as though it was not built, but placed there. What is most astonishing is not that it exists, but how it was made to endure. For the truth lies within. Beneath its surface of stone is not merely a statue, but a creation in which humanity tested the limits of its own ambition. And perhaps the real question is not how high it stands, but what truly holds it upright from within. That question draws us back to the year 1921, when Brazil prepared to mark a century of independence. What they sought was not merely a monument, but a symbol, one vast enough to rise above all others, something visible from every direction, powerful enough to embody a nation still shaping its identity. And so they arrived at a decisive choice, not to build where it was easiest, but where it mattered most. Corcovado was more than a mountain. Rising to approximately 710 meters above sea level, it stood as a sheer mass of granite above the city of Rio de Janeiro, visible from nearly every vantage point, from the sea, from the inland hills, and from the heart of the city itself. Yet this very prominence made it one of the most difficult sights imaginable. The slopes were steep, the terrain unforgiving. There was no level ground for construction, and access by conventional means was nearly impossible. It was a place never intended to become a worksite. This was no longer a question of terrain, but of vision. For if a symbol was to represent an entire nation, it could not remain grounded. It had to stand where every eye would be drawn. Yet at that very point, the question was no longer whether it could be built, but what it must become to be worthy of such a place. The answer did not emerge from a single mind, but from an entire nation. In 1920, a large-scale movement was set in motion by the Catholic Church of Brazil, calling upon the people to take part in the creation of a national symbol, a declaration shaped in stone, in faith, and in aspiration. The engineer Heitor de Silva Costa won the design competition, yet from the beginning, he did not pursue a single vision. Several proposals were considered, each overt in its symbolism: a colossal cross, a Christ figure holding a globe, or a form rising above the world itself. In his earliest sketches, Silva Costa chose the most direct expression: a standing Christ, bearing both cross and globe. It was unmistakable, yet heavy, rigid, and lacking emotional resonance. The response was immediate. Rather than inspiring reverence, the design stirred controversy, drew criticism, and was swiftly set aside. And in that moment, everything had to change. Silva Costa could not merely revise the idea. He had to begin again. He left Brazil and traveled to Europe, seeking a new direction, one where art and engineering might converge. From that journey, an entirely different vision began to take shape. Christ with arms outstretched, holding nothing, standing upon no pedestal of symbolism, for the very body of the figure becomes the cross itself. A design shaped in the spirit of Art Deco, minimal, balanced, stripped of all excess to preserve only its most powerful lines. No longer a complex figure, but a clear geometric form, one that could be recognized from any distance. Yet it is this very simplicity that transforms the nature of the work. It is no longer merely a statue, but a structure of immense load and force. The outstretched arms span nearly 28 meters, extending into open air, while the figure itself rises to approximately 30 meters in height, a mass of hundreds of tons lifted above the ground. From that moment, it ceases to be sculpture. It becomes a structure that must contend with wind, with gravity, and with imbalance at great elevation. A form that is perfect in symbol, yet among the most perilous in engineering. And the question is no longer how it appears, but how it can be made to stand. Yet the true challenge lay not in height, but in the way the wind moved around the mountain itself. When currents from the Atlantic struck Corcovado, they did not simply pass over it. They bent, rebounded, and were forced into spirals around the granite mass, forming turbulent streams that shifted constantly in direction and intensity. In the fiercest storms, wind speeds could exceed 200 kilometers per hour, generating immense lateral pressure across the entire structure. This was no longer mere wind, but an invisible force, unpredictable, relentless. In such conditions, the outstretched arms ceased to be symbolic. They became the most critical load-bearing elements of the entire form. Each gust imposed not only pressure, but bending, torsion, and vibrations that traveled through the structure. Meanwhile, the entire mass, hundreds of tons, stood upon the summit as a single structural system. There was no redundancy, no generous margin for error. The question was not whether it could stand, but how long it could endure before a fracture would appear. It was for this reason that Silva Costa turned to Albert Caquot, one of Europe's foremost structural engineers of the time. His task was not merely to calculate weight, but to foresee how the entire monument would respond to forces that shifted with every passing moment. For in a structure such as this, even the slightest miscalculation would not bring immediate collapse. It would begin with a fracture, and once such a structure begins to crack, there is no second chance. Once the form of the statue had been decided, a far greater challenge emerged at once. What material could endure in such a place, perched upon the summit of Corcovado, exposed to wind, rain, and the salt-laden air from the sea? The structure would have to resist not only time, but the elements themselves. In the year 1920, this was no simple choice, but a matter of intense debate. Steel, the emblem of the industrial age, had already proven its strength and precision in monuments such as the Eiffel Tower. Yet Silva Costa understood the danger. In the humid saline environment of Corcovado, steel would corrode from within, demanding a level of maintenance that would be nearly impossible atop such a mountain. And so he chose against the prevailing current. Reinforced concrete, a material still new at the time, offered a different promise, rigid enough to stand, yet flexible enough to absorb and disperse the constant forces acting upon it. But even that was not sufficient. If the outer surface were to crack, the entire internal structure would be exposed to gradual destruction. It was then that he found his answer in soapstone, quarried from the region of Minas Gerais. This stone possessed a remarkable quality. When first extracted, it was soft enough to be cut and shaped by hand. Yet once exposed to the open air, it hardened, stabilized, resisted water, and endured the shifting conditions of the environment with quiet resilience. Thus, the outer surface was never intended as mere decoration. It became a mineral armor, refined enough to form a smooth and luminous exterior, yet durable enough to shield the vital structure beneath. A concrete core to sustain its form, a skin of stone to resist the passage of time. And in that union, the fate of the monument was sealed. For had this choice been wrong from the beginning, the statue might have been built, but it would never have endured long enough to become the symbol it is today. Yet even after the question of materials had been resolved, another challenge arose at once. How could such a monumental vision be translated into precise form, down to the finest detail, when the construction site itself lay atop a mountain nearly impossible to reach? The answer did not begin in Brazil, but in Paris. In his studio at Boulogne-Billancourt, the sculptor Paul Landowski did not work directly upon the monument. Instead, he began with full-scale models of its most critical elements, the heads and the hands. The head standing approximately 3 3/4 meters tall, and each hand extending beyond 3 meters, were no longer mere models. They were immense structures in their own right, demanding absolute precision. Yet the true marvel lay not in their size, but in how they would be transformed into the final monument. Each model was divided into dozens of smaller sections, forming detailed negative molds. These were carefully numbered, packed, and transported across the ocean to Rio de Janeiro. There, they were not simply reassembled. Instead, they served as forms into which reinforced concrete was cast directly on site, piece by piece, layer by layer, following a sequence calculated in advance. This was no longer sculpture in the traditional sense. It was a vast three-dimensional system of assembly. Every segment had to align perfectly with the internal metal framework already in place. A slight deviation at the base could result in significant misalignment above, an error nearly impossible to correct once the structure had risen. At the time, it was regarded as one of the largest three-dimensional assemblies ever attempted. But unlike a game, there was no opportunity to begin again. Each piece, each mold, each pour of concrete was final. And from this process, seemingly artistic in nature, another truth became clear. This statue was not carved. It was assembled with the precision of an engineered structure. There were no duplicates, no second attempts. Every piece was a final decision. Yet all calculations truly began only when the structure was brought to the mountaintop. There were no roads, no vehicles for transport. The only connection was the Corcovado Railway, along which every sack of cement, every steel bar, every mold shipped from Paris had to be carried upward, aboard small, slow-moving trains, again and again, day after day. And once they arrived, there was no space to store them. What reached the summit in the morning had to be used before the day was done. The construction site had to function with the precision of a system, without margin for error. Meanwhile, the environment resisted at every turn. Mist covered the peak for much of the time, reducing visibility to only a few meters. The scaffolding remained damp and treacherous. The wind could shift without warning, sweeping across unfinished structures and turning every movement into a calculated risk. The workers existed in near isolation from the world below, surrounded by clouds, by wind, and by a structure suspended in incompletion at great height. They were not merely building a monument. They were building within conditions where a single misstep could bring everything to an abrupt and permanent end. By every measure of logic, such a site should have been marked by tragedy. Yet the reality was the opposite. Over nearly 9 years of construction, not a single fatality was recorded. A monument raised under conditions that bordered on the impossible, where danger was present in every step, yet completed without the loss of a single life. Not merely an engineering achievement, but something that defies explanation. From the outside, the statue appears as a solid monumental mass, yet in truth, it is entirely hollow within, a structure rising to the height of a building some 10 to 13 stories tall, supported by a system of beams and columns designed to distribute its full weight into foundations anchored directly to the mountain's rock. Hidden inside is a narrow staircase guiding the way from the base to the arms and the head, a technical space almost entirely invisible from the outside. The inner passages are confined, enclosed, and largely cut off from natural light. But as one ascends to a certain height, level with the chest of the statue, the space unexpectedly opens. There, it is no longer a place for people, but for the structure itself, the very heart of the monument. Silva Costa created a small heart-shaped detail, cast both within and without, executed with meticulous care. A detail that cannot be seen from the ground, concealed deep within the chest of the statue, like a secret revealed only to those who step inside, and like a quiet mark left behind for those who would come after. Yet for such a structure to endure through time, the decisive factor lies not within, but upon its outer surface, the only layer exposed directly to wind, rain, and the relentless erosion of the years. And it is here that another challenge emerges. How does one cover a form of such vast curvature without distorting its precision? The answer did not come from machines, but from human hands. This was no act of decoration, but a process of meticulous, almost microscopic craftsmanship. Even the slightest deviation across a curved surface could compromise the integrity of the whole. The entire exterior was clad in approximately 6 million small triangular tiles, each measuring only about 3 centimeters per side and 1 centimeter in thickness. Each piece was cut and arranged to follow every contour of the monument. Rather than being placed directly onto the structure, they were first set by hand onto sheets of fabric, then carried to the summit and pressed onto the still fresh concrete, forming a mineral skin that enveloped the entire figure. Yet what makes this process remarkable is not only the technique. Thousands of people, many of them women from parishes across Rio de Janeiro, took part in this work. They did not merely place the stones. On the reverse side of each tile, they inscribed the names of loved ones, fragments of prayers, or private wishes. Thus, the surface of the statue does more than catch the changing light of the day. It carries within it millions of human traces, hidden deep inside the structure, unseen by the world. A layer that protects not only against time and moisture, but preserves the intangible. A skin formed not merely to endure, but to hold the shape of an idea made vast. Standing upon an isolated summit, the statue of Christ the Redeemer becomes one of the most powerful lightning attractors in Rio de Janeiro. Each year, the region of Corcovado endures hundreds of lightning strikes, especially during the rainy season, when storms rolling in from the Atlantic rise directly against the mountain. Yet the statue does not stand there passively. Within it lies a conductive system that functions much like a Faraday cage, allowing the current of each strike to pass through the structure and descend safely into foundations anchored in solid granite. Lightning rods are integrated into the crown and the outstretched arms, not to prevent the strikes, but to ensure survival after each impact. Even so, in 2014, an exceptionally powerful bolt struck the statue, breaking part of the right thumb. A small detail, yet enough to reveal the true limits of the structure when confronted with the forces of nature. The repair itself bordered on the impossible. There was no scaffolding, no stable platform, only technicians suspended by ropes from the summit, moving along the arms in open air. And the replacement stone could not be sourced from elsewhere. It had to come from the original soapstone quarries used in the 1930s. And this was not an isolated event. Lightning continues to strike year after year. After nearly a century, the monument does not stand untouched. It is still tested, still eroded, still repaired piece by piece, as though it were not a finished creation, but a struggle that has never truly ended. From the outside, it is only a statue, but as one moves through its layers, through structure, through engineering, through decisions pushed to their very limits, it ceases to be a mere construction. It is not simply something that was built, but a boundary that was crossed. Not only art, nor only engineering, but the point at which human thought, belief, and will converge. Intangible forces shaped into a form that can stand against wind, against height, and against time. For this reason, the statue of Christ the Redeemer no longer belongs to a single nation. It has become a global symbol, a work not created merely to endure, but to prove that humanity can surpass the limits it once believed were fixed. And in the end, what remains is not the structure itself, but the imprint of those who brought it into being. From an idea that once seemed impossible, to a structure that stands against wind, against height, and against time. We see a statue, but behind it lies thousands of decisions, millions of details, and nearly a decade in which humanity pushed its limits to their very edge. And perhaps the most compelling question is not how high it rises, nor how it was constructed, but this: in an age without modern technology, without ideal conditions, how was it possible for human beings to create something that should not have endured at all? And when we look back upon that entire journey, what astonishes most is not the method of its construction, but why, in such circumstances, humanity was still able to achieve it. So the true question remains: do human limits truly exist? Or have we simply not yet reached them?